we have Amanda Schoonmaker from the Center of Boreal Research with Nate in Peace River. Amanda, do you want to first off, welcome to Industry Talks with Forteck. And yeah, do you want to just maybe explain a bit about the place that you work and your expertise in the industry?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me on today to talk a little bit about our center and our research team here. Again, I'm Amanda Schoonmaker. I'm one of the researchers at the NATE Center for Boreal Research. We are physically located in Peace River, Alberta, about 500 kilometers northwest of Edmonton. And it's a smaller research center. The facility itself is about 9,000 square feet. We have 2 laboratories, an office space, an outdoor growing area, and a 3-bay greenhouse with controls for environmental settings. And we aim to help industry find interesting and novel ways to restore disturbed systems back into either productive forests, wetlands, or anything else in between, depending on the outcome of that particular site. So we have 3 research teams, one in forest land reclamation, which is the team I head up, another one in peatland restoration, which is headed up by my colleague, Dr. Binshu, and plant and seed technologies, which is also a technology access center, and that's headed up by Dr. Jean-Marie Subse. And we also have a presence in research extension and education, and that is another program that really tries to get a lot of this information that we're doing in the field back out to the public and to industry and to practitioners to ensure that the things we're learning on the ground are being translated into knowledge that folks can take up and utilize in ways that make sense for them. So that is
awesome.
Kind of the yeah.
And how long have you been working there?
I joined the center in August 2011. And so I've been a little over 10 years, and my colleague Jean-Marie's been there for about 11 and a half, and Ben's, I think, 9 and a half. So we're all kind of in that decade or a little bit past decade of experience here in the northern region.
I even had my little taste of working with Amanda. I was a summer student that would have been 2014. Yeah, in the summer of 2014. So I worked primarily on Amanda's crew. I worked with Ben as well, and Jean-Marie a bit, but mostly with Amanda. And some of the things that I remember doing when I was there was planting trees, measuring trees. When I was working with Ben's projects, we were measuring carbon in the peatlands. Trying to think of some of the other stuff that we did. That was a lot of what we did during the summer. I actually spent some time with one of the other members from NATE, Mark Dewey, and we had spent time traveling around looking at some of the past reclaimed leaf sites and capturing information on a variety of leaf sites around the Peace regions and beyond. So that was my bit of experience. We also did some seed collections, I remember, as well. So driving around looking for poplar fuzz, balsam poplar, and aspen, and yeah, capturing seeds as much as we could for the greenhouse. So that was my brief experience working there, and it was very beneficial to me in my career, understanding a lot of the different ways that reclamation and remediation can be done. And now that I work in industry, it's great to have some of that background. And I think what Amanda wanted to touch on today is just some of the findings that she's had over the years. And a lot of our viewers on Industry Talks with Forteck are people in the forest industries, a lot of foresters, professional foresters, a lot of the people that are making these critical decisions in the industry. So Amanda, maybe if you wanted to just touch on sort of during your time at the Center for Boreal Research, what has been some of your most interesting projects that you've worked on, and why, and how does that relate to industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of pick one particular project. I like everything we do. So, I mean, I got into this field really because of a love of science and a love of growing plants. And this job allows me to do both of those things. So it's quite hard to pick and choose. I think something I do want to talk about kind of integrates work from a number of different projects, and it's this idea of our end goal. So when we are in, and I'm going to speak specifically to sites that where we're trying to either grow productive forest or potentially grow some sort of functional forest community. I definitely am not an expert in wetlands, so I will leave that to another conversation that maybe you could have with my colleague. But when we're talking about forest land reclamation, you know, it's more than just parking a few trees out there and calling it good. We need to ensure that what we're doing to these sites is going to put it on a trajectory to be a functional and resilient forest ecosystem. And I say that because if we don't ensure we put that, you know, the soils in such a way and these basic structures and functions in a particular way, we run the risk of these sites becoming at risk to future disturbances. So if a fire rips through this site in, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, if it's resilient, it should be able to regenerate after that fire. But if we haven't put back those good functional indicators and those good key functional species, these sites may actually go back to that sort of early successional phase of graminoids and herbaceous plants, and it may really set it back for a long period of time. So I kind of wanted to discuss why we need to think conscientiously about this and maybe some ways we might be able to go about it. So what we're seeing in many of our data sets is where we can put in resilience, put in a mixture of conifers and deciduous species, we probably have the better building blocks for something that will be able to tolerate a disturbance in the future. So if we have a fire rip through that site in 5 or 10 years, if we have aspen or balsam poplar, paper birch in our mixture, these species are known to sprout back out either from stump suckers or root suckers, and then that site will become a forest again one day, right? It'll just be set back by a few years. If we only plant white spruce to it or only lodgepole pine and the site is still very young, if the site's 100 years old, that might be fine. We might have a pure pine stand and a fire rips through and all the cones open and everything's good. But if the stand is young, then that monoculture is going to be susceptible to that particular risk. And we may have an image of what I see in the background of my photo here. And this is a site I walked into last spring that had been planted to white spruce a number of years ago. And then it was either the 2018 or 19 burns west of Manning came through there and, you know, burned that whole site down. And now the only thing regenerating is grasses. And in the site, because now it's being taken over by grasses, is likely to stay this way for many years to come. There was no evidence of aspen suckering into it or anything. So the site is at risk and it's likely going to stay in this sort of early successional phase for many years. So planting is certainly one way by which we can try to get some of that additional diversity in on the front end if we choose to plant a little bit more intimate mixture of different trees and shrubs. Another way is through some of our site preparation techniques. So if we prepare the sites in such a way that we can expose mineral soil for a longer period of time to create a better seed bed for natural recovery. So if we're planting perhaps, again, conifers, this is common across the province to plant things like white spruce or lodgepole pine or jack pine as you go further east. Hardwoods are a little less common, though people are definitely planting more of them now because there is value and there is benefit to doing so. But by and large, if you are going to focus on conifer planting, then at least if the seed bed is being prepared in such a way that you can get better seed rains. So you don't have it taken over by herbaceous species right away, so that there's time for that balsam poplar, aspen, willows to actually seed into the site. Because if they can seed into the site, a few plants can make a difference. Those few plants can start to spread and sucker into more plants. And that's something we've been seeing on some of our other projects. After 4 or 5 years, balsam poplar is actually pretty good at multiplying. So it's multiplying through root suckers and actually occupying more of that land than it did in its early years. So creating those conditions becomes ever more important, and being conscientious about what those conditions are going to be is, I think, critical to knowing whether or not you're creating the beginnings of a resilient system, or one that is going to carry more risk. The other reason to do it outside of kind of resilience from these large scale disturbances is resilience from smaller scale disturbances and insect outbreaks and some of these other biotic factors. So with the same idea, if you have an insect that is host specific, it could wipe out your single tree species if that's all you have on that site. And so planting more than one is another way to kind of buffer your own risk as you manage these sites. Because I mean, it'd sure be a shame if you have sites where you've been growing your trees up for a number of years and you're ready to certify it, and here we go, you get I don't know, spruce budworm or something that just rolls through and wipes out your young plantation, and then you've got to start from scratch again. So at least, again, multiple species representing different types of tree species or even shrub species is going to help create some of that additional resilience. That's like one of the, I guess, one of the bigger things I wanted to raise today. It was kind of a long ramble. You might want to interrupt me now and maybe redirect me onto, I don't know, subsequent question or topic, but that's one thing that's sort of top of mind that I'm seeing in a lot of our work now, is just the importance of putting that structure in there.
No, that was super beneficial information for me, and I really appreciate the insight on that. I had a couple of follow-up questions on, I guess, shrubs. What kind of shrubs do you recommend planting in with, say, the conifer and deciduous species?
Yeah, it's somewhat going to depend on your soils and the region that you're in, of course. You know, some general things that we've been seeing. I mean, willows are going to do quite well, although willows tend to be one of the ones that come in better on their own. So if you're going to spend effort in putting in shrubs, it's in some ways nicer to focus on species that you might not get through natural recovery quite as readily. If you anticipate a very competitive site, though, maybe planting willows is advantageous. And as most people will know, you know, willows can be established from unrooted cuttings. So you can actually collect willow sticks and keep them cold. If you collect them in, you know, late spring or early spring, like April, you can keep them refrigerated or frozen and actually deploy them as unrooted cuttings in the springtime. You do need to be conscientious about handling and the size of material and even the species you collect it from. So we've seen some evidence that there's certain species that really don't root well from an unrooted cutting, whereas others do very well. And I mean, you can still collect seed of willows and actually use that for propagation, or use cuttings and then root them. If you have time, I would always advocate for rooting something over putting it in as an unrooted cutting, mainly because of that increased risk with a poor spring. So if you have a very dry spring, those cuttings are going to have higher rates of mortality, whereas a rooted plant has a little less risk that way. So, you know, willows in certain cases, but again, you know, that's knowing your conditions and knowing what kind of site you have. You may not need to. Alders are a nice group to work with. Green alder, where you have more loamy or sandier soils, tend to work really well, and they grow very quickly. But they won't necessarily take over your site, but they'll actually create structural cover very fast, as you know, your white spruce or lodgepole pine are coming up through the grass and clover and all the other things we're familiar with on these you know, post-industrial sites. But in finer textured soils where they're a lot more clay rich, we've seen a little bit more kind of mixed response in green alder. But we tend to get better response in that case with river alder, Alnus incana. And this one grows much taller. You want to be conscientious on the densities you put river alder in at, because that will take over your site early on, just because it gets to be like 5 to 8 meters tall. So, you know, you want to be conscientious of how much you put in there, but river alder definitely tolerates that more clay-rich soil a lot better than green alder does, at least from places we planted it in. And might be a better candidate. So it's again partly knowing those site conditions. We've had good success planting Western Dogwood. This one can be a little hit and miss to collect seed or have seed available for it, but it does typically do quite well on a range of reclaimed industrial sites. But it is prone to browsing, which is, you know, depending on what your goals and outcomes are, isn't necessarily a bad thing. You just may not get very big cover from it in terms of managing some of the other species on site, because it will be preferentially browsed by the local wildlife. Buffalo berry is another one, but again, this one, you know, in some sites we see it do really well, and others not so much. It's a little more hit and miss. That might be partly a consequence of stock quality, and then also perhaps soil texture. I think it's maybe a little bit sensitive in the same way a green alder is to that really massive, heavy textured soils. But I don't have enough data to kind of say that one way or the other. Those are sort of the ones that come top of my mind, but you know, certainly there's lots of shrubs out there that a person can monkey around with, and that's certainly have value. One shrub that you generally don't need to plant, but what we've seen in some other work that tends to come in more readily with increasing ripping and soil movement is raspberries. So raspberries are also nice in terms of creating a little bit of different cover other than graminoid cover or clover cover, but they seem to be enhanced where we have a more rough and loose condition. I think this is more having to do with that increased soil movement. So, you know, additional ripping or plowing, that increased soil disturbance, perhaps mechanically scarifies the seed more effectively, and then you get better seed emergence. That's maybe is part of the reason, but in some quantitative work that we've seen over the years, raspberry definitely comes in better with a rougher soil treatment. So again, in terms of enhancing, you know, what you have there, instead of planting it all, you know, some of these soil treatments might be of utility that way.
I remember visiting some sites when we were at NATE, and they were ripped quite heavily. And if I remember right, the reason for that was so that they're way less compacted, and it's typically just going to settle back down, right? So the first year it's going to look super intense, but it's going to, you know, settle over time. And we were dealing with heavily past compacted sites. So do you want to maybe just touch on like a bit about site prep and what you think some best practices are, or some things to maybe play with in regards to site preparation?
Sure. Yeah, so site preparation, you know, can mean a number of things, right? So we'll maybe try to unpack that a little bit. So in site preparation, there's decompaction, right? When we have soils that are truly compacted, we're decompacting them. But we may also be doing site preparation to create heterogeneity. We may be doing site preparation to break up a grass layer. So in legacy sites or sites that have been sitting for many years and we need to try to reforest them in some way, we really are trying to do site preparation to displace grass sod. So the treatments we use may be the same, or they may be not, you know, depending on how much compaction is in there. So, you know, I think Dave Polster was one of the folks that said it best. I mean, rough and loose all the way, whether you're going to mound it or plow it. You know, create a condition that's rough and loose so that you can get better heterogeneity in the soil, and that heterogeneity might actually create different seed beds, and it may also reduce something I've seen, at least, is on these rougher surfaces. I think that heterogeneity also reduces the pace at which some of these rhizomatous grass species can spread. They don't spread as effectively when you have a great big rough surface with lots of weird microsites that are maybe not available right away, and gaps and voids. It breaks up that surface from being completely overrun by these more dominant graminoids. And then you can get a greater amount of heterogeneity in terms of vegetation development, or give the site time for other species to come in, native herbaceous species. We haven't spoken much about that, but there's, I think, real value in thinking about native forbs that can be put into these sites to help create, again, structural diversity, so that you don't end up in a 1 or 2 tree grass system, which is where many of these sites end up going if left to kind of their own devices at times. We want to try to impose as much diversity into that system as possible. So if creating a rough and loose condition holds the site from being taken over by any one species initially, that's probably beneficial to us. And the other reason for rough and loose or some type of decompaction, again, is to create a better growing environment for the plants we're trying to develop. So even if the site is competitive initially with herbaceous species, if the tree species we're trying to target have a looser soil condition, the soil is not a great big mass of clay, that's going to be beneficial. The more effectively these species can develop a root system, the more effectively they're going to compete with other vegetation that comes in, and then the quicker they're going to get above that competing herbaceous canopy. But if we're planting into heavily compacted or not very well loosened soils, that's, you know, a recipe for creating additional stress. And these species may come through it, but it takes a lot longer, and that time puts you at risk and puts the site at risk for other things that might try to wipe it out in the meantime. Whereas if you can do a better job of decompaction, then you might actually get you will get better tree growth and development, better shrub development, and just occupancy with a wider range of species more readily than kind of conventional practice. So most folks that we've, or that at least I've observed in sort of the reclamation field, will do some type of decompaction. Using straight rippers are common. You know, something like a six is ripping the subsoil or the clay that's underlying it, and then usually other soils are placed over top. They're often placed over top with dozers. And it's at that stage that I think we're reintroducing compaction if we don't do something subsequent to that. So I would always, you know, advocate for, after that topsoil placement, some other treatment is imposed on it, whether it's mounding or plowing or something to that effect. It's creating that really rough and loose condition with lots of voids and cracks, so that you can continue to have these free thaw events progress over time and do that decompaction for you, so that you don't really end up with a settled site right away. It's a bit of a long-winded answer, because I don't think there is one particular way it needs to be done, but it's thinking about the principles, right, of what that site treatment is going to do for you and how it's going to behave over time. As you say, everything is going to settle, but it's a question of how quickly you want those things to settle and what vegetation is going to be able to take hold during that progression.
Awesome, thank you for that. One thing that I've thought of before is there's quite a few sites out there that are, you know, naturally partly grown in or have some bigger trees on them. What sort of process do you think is the best for going about those sites that, you know, the access is completely grown in and the site's half grown in, but it maybe was never recontoured? I guess it depends if there's infrastructure still on the site or not, but I don't know much about partially grown in sites and what the process should be around those. I haven't dealt with it much personally.
And I haven't either. So I've had an opportunity a few years ago to actually field tour with a company that had a lot of sites like this. So they had a lot of these older sites where they had regrown quite well. And so they were dealing with smaller bits of infrastructure around well center and a little bit of recontouring around well center, but they actually didn't want to disturb a lot of the site because, as you say, a lot of it had regrown. Is it worthwhile ripping up the topsoil and subsoil piles to recontour it perfectly? Or is it better to treat that smaller teardrop or well center and then replant that and without disturbing the other area? I don't know if I know the answer. There's regulatory consequences that have to be considered. And I think, these sites are probably really approached on a case-by-case basis and maybe a risk analysis of the risk of doing nothing versus the risk of doing something versus the risk of doing a lot of something. It's always going to be site specific. So it's another non-answer, but I think it depends. I don't think it should just be, yes, you always have to rip the site up, or no, you always shouldn't. It is going to be contextually, you're right, it is going to be about access. It is going to be about what infrastructure is already there. I mean, if you have a 5-kilometer access that you're going to mow down to treat, a 30-meter by 30-meter area, I don't know, maybe that doesn't make very much sense. Maybe we need to look at other treatments or less invasive treatments. So it's always going to be about that context and what the local folks that are out there, whatever that local community or local population also wants to see back on that landscape, or how they want to see that area or region treated. So, an approach that I think more companies are going towards is this idea of area-based reclamation to try to circumvent some of these issues. They go in, they disturb an area all at the same time, and they roll out all at the same time. So we don't have these little stranded sites all over the landscape that you're trying to do as almost one-offs. So to try to eliminate some of those issues. And the other thing to think about too is, although these stockpiles of soil may be really regrown with trees and shrubs, it's not that they can't grow them again. So if you still have a fairly large site that you really do want to recontour, reclaim properly, and you are going to need to disturb these topsoil and subsoil piles with trees growing on them, employ good practices when you're doing it. Utilize the wood that's sitting on those stockpiles for final reclamation. Handle the soils in such a way that you have lots of good root fragments from those stockpiles that are going to support that second regeneration of forest. If handled well, that soil that's growing effectively a forest on it right now could be a real utility for reclamation of the whole area. So I think as a human population, we always feel bad when we cut down trees, kind of intuitively, but trees are capable of regrowing. Many of them are, and the system is okay with disturbance, right? Provided it's under the right context and right situation. So, there's going to be cases where taking down those piles does make sense, trees and all, depending on the circumstances of that particular site. But that's where, again, you're advised to really be conscientious about what you're ripping down and trying to utilize that good quality material, because there's a huge root propagule bank that's probably at your disposal that may allow you to not even plant any trees. You may be allowed to go to full natural recovery and get really good recovery if you don't mash up the root systems excessively. So
yeah,
right there, but that's understanding a little bit about the biology of what's growing in those piles, right, and how to utilize it more effectively. And it's maybe something that we don't do as often. A lot of the piles we have lots of grasses and other things in it that we want to rip up as much as possible so that they don't spread. But you actually want to do the opposite with the trees and shrubs growing on these piles.
I wanted to touch on spraying a bit. The topic always is it can be subjective in industry, but I guess when is a good time to spray in your opinion, and when should you avoid it? And I think at the end of the day, it depends on what your goals are and things like that. But obviously, if there's weeds that shouldn't be there, there's a lot of reasons to spray. What have you seen effective with spraying, and what are some of the complications of spraying sites?
Okay. So that's a that's a hot topic. So I think I'll preface all of this by saying I may say things that counter what the regulatory requirement is, first of all. So utilizing herbicides, again, comes down, and you nailed it right away. So it's about the goals. You should utilize herbicide the way you utilize any other tool, and it's with that end in mind. Why am I using this herbicide? What is it going to do for me by using it once, twice, or 3 times? They are effective when they're used judiciously, when they're used under the circumstances that are valuable for them. But at the same time, if we're using herbicide to chase around a few noxious weeds and we're growing an otherwise nice forest vegetation community on that site, we might want to rethink that. I don't know if you've heard this or seen this, but I've definitely heard it as a complaint from more than one person over the years. We send that herbicide crew in to manage some Canada thistle or something on a site that's regenerating nicely with poplars and spruce and nice native forbs, and you come back in 5 years and it's just grass because it was sprayed too heavily, right? They, in their effort to eradicate all those noxious weeds, they wiped out all the things that were regenerating nicely on the site. Because the thing that kills the Canada thistle is the same thing that kills the balsam poplar and the fireweed and all the other good stuff that's in there. So, we, especially post planting, post soil placement, I think we should be very conscientious and judicious in how we use herbicides. And again, have those discussions with the local forest officer or AER person, whoever it is your contact is in the field for these sites. Make decisions in the field. Am I okay with some weeds in this site if my site is otherwise growing other things that I believe are going to be functional and effective in the health of that system in the long run? And what's the risk? If I send the herbicide crew in there, are they going to be very targeted and very specific in terms of where they're going to be applying herbicide? Or are they going to do something a little more aggressive? Are they going to run out there with an ATV with a sprayer on the boom and run around grabbing larger patches and taking out larger areas and some of your other desirable vegetation along with it? So, I think go ahead.
Oh, all I was going to say is, as we were chatting at the beginning about having more species, like deciduous species and shrub species and stuff, like if it's in forest industry, if you're targeting conifer, for example, you can spray when the conifers are hardened off and not affect them. But if you're going to be targeting multiple species that are affected by spray, then it's going to be very hard to target that specific noxious weed or undesirable species when you have deciduous and shrub on site, especially if you paid to plant deciduous and shrub. Following site prep, when would you recommend the best time to, like, if you were going to spray a full site, because say it had heavy grass come up or something prior to planting, how long after site prep would you recommend doing that? If the site prep, say, was done in the winter, would you do it that next fall, or would you give it a whole nother year?
If you did site prep in the winter and you have trees and you have a vegetation plan, I would always advocate for planting the site promptly.
Yeah.
So you get the trees in before the competition takes hold, right? So if you've done a good job of site preparation or decompaction, you've got this nice rough and loose condition, you have your trees, shrubs, whatever it is you're going to plant available, you plant promptly. Don't plant into heavy competition. If you're at that stage, then yes, herbicide might be a viable option when the competition is already up. And there's different things, I mean, different herbicides a person can look at, right? I mean, certainly
Yeah.
glyphosate is a widely used one, but there are other potential treatments out there, but you have to be careful about the label. Arsenal's another one that is got some label use in forestry, but it's minor use, and there's a lot of limitations in terms of how it's actually applied. So, you know, you do have to look at those things carefully, but I would always advocate for just prompt planting, because that gets you out of, you know, necessarily using herbicides altogether, and your site is then kind of at a nice loose condition that your trees can take advantage of the best, because it's not just above ground competition, it's also below ground competition that's impactful. And as more stuff invades into that site, that below ground real estate becomes smaller and smaller. But if your trees are getting in there at the beginning, when, you know, no one's bought any houses in the new rec site below ground, so to speak, they're, you know, they're the first houses on the market, you know, developing the root system out. And
Yeah.
kind of a goofy analogy, but you know, they're able to occupy that space first because they were there first.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think if you're in a case where you've done site preparation, your trees are delayed, or your shrubs are, you know, your vegetation deployment strategy is delayed, then yes, looking at herbicide treatment, you know, pre-planting, post-site prep, then becomes an option. So, you know, there is some people experiment, you know, there is some folks starting to look a little bit at pre-emergent herbicides as well to try to reduce some of that seed.
Right. Yeah.
That will maybe buy you some time, but pre-emergents tend to be specific to seed-based regeneration. So if you have a lot of rhizomatous species in there, canna thistle, grasses that are spreading through rhizome, a pre-emergent herbicide isn't going to help you either, right? It needs to be some kind of post-emergent type of treatment. So yeah, again, planning, right? Plan from the beginning. So I know I'm going to be doing earthworks on this site and recontouring. Plan your sequencing out where you can. I mean, there is always going to be situations where you can't, because that's just how she rolls. But as much as you can, if you can plan out that tree order, site preparation, all of that in sequence so that it's one after another, I think this is the better recipe for a more kind of consistent and well-functioning reclamation product.
Yeah. Speaking of timing, one that I've been running into has been the time of year when the budgets come out for the orphan wells, and that's been a bit of a challenge for us, just like sourcing seed and things like that, because I believe it's in like March or April, something like that, for the upcoming season. So it can be quite challenging to figure out the funding approvals and then being able to still coordinate it all for that spring and summer. And I've been noticing a huge lack of trees in the industry at specific times. I think it's widely due to that, because there's a lot of unknowns until when the trees should be growing and you should know what's going on for the next season. Unfortunately, you don't get your approvals or know until spring, and then you got to try to source those seeds, and it ends up being a bunch of people looking for trees, is what I've been finding.
So you're trying to plant trees within 2 or 3 months of finding out on budget? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we've had situations where the budget's not getting approved until spring, and those sites are tentatively scheduled to be like planted that summer.
Yeah.
So
those are those ones that you can't control. And we know that's out there, you know, partly, I mean, I think
just to touch on that, we're not, we haven't been doing we're not a primary to the Orphan Well Association or anything. So we're just planting trees and sourcing trees and helping build prescriptions to provide insight to companies that are. So I'm not as familiar with how exactly that budget process works, other than just providing estimates and then waiting to hear that we have it approved or not. But so I can't specifically say, like, I don't know if you can, plan for it 2 years in advance, or like have it planned the year before for the next summer. like March for the next summer after, and then do your site prep that winter or something. I'm not sure exactly the process there, but I just know that it's been a concern for us, being the people going out to plant the trees, not then having to try to source those trees for that year. We actually had a whole bunch of sites this year that we were unable to plant because we didn't get approval until like April or May, and then we had to try to find seedlings for this summer, and then we didn't use the budget because we couldn't find the seedlings, and then now they got to reapply for budget for this spring, and we can't plant the seedlings this fall because we don't know for sure that we got approved to plant those sites for the next spring.
Yeah,
So,
and then you have seed zones to worry about on top of that too, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Even if you plant trees, you got to have the right zone. So yeah, it's a bit of a pickle. So I mean, part of the solution is, I think, education of the budget holders, and walking them through the logistics of this process and how seedling procurement works, especially for non-commercial species. So the way we end up, last minute getting things like this is going to be the commercial trees normally, right? And you're going to be getting overage from the forest industry or from the nurseries. They may have some extras, for short-term research projects. I know I've called nurseries in the past, or a few different nurseries, to see if they have little dribs and drabs for some of our experiments that are leftovers. But that is, you're at the mercy of what's kind of kicking around at that point. So it's definitely suboptimal. I don't think there's a good single solution here other than educating the budget holders about why we need to plan these things 2 years out, ideally, and or if you're the company that's doing the planting, the only other thing you can do is bear risk, right? Is have a standing order of seedlings that you are taking a risk on, and you grow them in the hopes that you're going to use them the next year, but they may be a loss, or you may find lots of good homes for them. The good thing is, even doing something like that, there's a whole bunch of other companies like you out there doing the same thing, that are also looking for trees, right? Someone's always looking for trees. If I know one thing, it's someone's looking for trees every spring somewhere. And it's whether or not it's all compatible. Like, I mean, maybe there needs to be like a last minute tree Facebook club of some kind in northern Alberta that you sign up your overages, and it's kind of like a a tree dating app of some kind. To people that way, because I'm just thinking, like, I had extra trees from the Northwest on a project that I think some of them got chucked. If I'd known you needed trees, we could have coordinated, right? But so I think part of it is calling the right people, and finding, knowing who's out there planting, and that's a lot of these smaller planting companies and service providers. There's a number of them in Alberta, and it's kind of getting to know all those little players. But I mean, that's, again, not necessarily an efficient business either, an optimal business model. But that's kind of where things are right now. But I think that the better strategy is educating the budget holders on why we need to plan this out longer, and that they're going to get a better product. Because now, you say, all those sites didn't get planted, and that's important. That's going to have an effect on those sites, because now they're going to be looking at other treatments to, make room for the veg that's coming in and the subsequent planting. And that all costs extra. And it may not be giving us as good a land reclamation product as we maybe could have, because we haven't ideally sequenced the revegetation prescription. So,
I would say in the forest industry, working for woodlands groups, like, it's very well structured. It's they plant in the summer, and then they plan and look at the sites in the fall, and basically put in their tree orders and start planning for the next summer's planting. And that's the way that it should be, I think, in the oil and gas or the reclamation industry as well. So it's something that you're right, educate and strive for over time, and try to
Mhm.
get better, try to have everyone get better together. So
Exactly, yeah, and communicating that, right? And,
yeah,
explaining what it is, right? I mean, it isn't, we don't go to Walmart and pick up some white spruce seedlings to go plant on our rec site. It doesn't work like that. It's not like the horticulture industry in that sense. It's a different process. So it's educating, and I think more people are being educated. I mean, I've seen a lot of good presentations. Tree Time has given a number of presentations over the years. They're probably one of the bigger, planting vendors out there in Alberta, and they've given some really great talks over the years for the reasons of education, right? To
yeah,
educate the broader public. So yeah, I think everyone's just got to keep, doing doing the thing and pounding the conversation out about that, and we'll get better.
yeah, definitely,
Yeah. It'll save people money. And I think,
yeah,
adding that to the conversation that this is a more cost effective way to run will probably also resonate. If people can tie that longer planning and the need for that longer planning window to cost savings, then you've got additional rationale that really starts to resonate
yeah.
with businesses.
Well, we can work for less money too if we know that we're going to have X amount of workload next summer, because we are competing with forestry planting companies, and tree planters want to secure their positions for this next summer.
Mhm.
So next spring and summer. So the earlier that we know, the sooner we can know how many people we need to hire and the number of qualified positions that we need to do, and we can start getting those people hired. And rather than trying to pick them up after we know in May that we have to plant some trees this summer, and then trying to find whoever's left, right? Rather than having pre-planned 6 or 8 months ahead of time. Here's the workload. It's a lot more efficient for us, and we can find better people for better rates rather than having to try to scoop people up and maybe having to pay more because we're looking last minute to fill our staffing capabilities. So
Yeah, and I'm sure that, I mean, that works for any operating business, right? I mean, more planning the better. So
yeah,
yeah, always areas of improvement.
yeah, cool. Well, that covered a lot of things. Really appreciate all of your insight, and I'm just going through my questions here, see if I had anything else, but
Sure.
that was pretty much it. Willow staking success percentages. Do you have much information on that?
Um, well, I think we do have a couple of technical notes on Willow staking. The numbers vary a lot by species. So I mentioned this a little bit kind of briefly earlier, but there's some real species specific specificity. Roll that one off your tongue, related to survivorship with staking. So part of it has to do with the size of the willow stake.
Great.
If they're too small, too thin, they don't do well. They don't, presumably this is because they don't have sufficient carbohydrate reserves in that stem to develop a root system and then develop a leaf system. And then also the species. So something like sandbar willow, Salix interior or Salix exigua, we've seen root readily from a cutting. It's probably one of the more readily rootable willows out there. And then on the other end of the spectrum, something like Salix bebiana, that's Bebb's willow, is much more of a conventional upland willow species. It roots very poorly from a cutting in the greenhouse. In controlled studies, I think we have numbers below 20% for that particular species. And then you have everything in between. As a general rule of thumb, willows that you collect from wetter areas tend to be in that right species mix or phenotype mix to root better in the field. Ones from drier areas, less so as a general rule. That's not necessarily, going to be true everywhere. I, again, would always advocate for rooting those plants first if you can, because you're going to have better outcomes. Because now a cutting is at the mercy of the conditions of the year and the competition of the year.
Yeah.
And cuttings are expensive. So if you've ever collected hardwood cuttings, something like a willow cutting probably shouldn't be less than 60 centimeters long, any upwards of a meter. I would say 60 centimeters to a meter in length, and minimum, width of your thumb in terms of size. So that's like a pretty substantial sized cutting, and getting that kind of mass. And I think, many are much larger than this. So this material costs a lot to collect, and you're often collecting at the time of year when there's a lot of snow. So this makes it also tricky to collect cuttings in 3 feet of snow. It's just slow that way. So that's kind of where a rooted seedling is more beneficial. But willow cuttings have a lot of utility in bioengineering application, and that tends to be where folks are utilizing them the most, right? Because they're also serving a structural function in terms of slope stabilization or related items. So there's other reasons to use cuttings other than just for general reclamation. But it, again, comes down to that goal. If it's just to have another species on your sites, I would, take the effort to collect smaller material, root it in the greenhouse first, and then outplant it. But if time is precious and you don't have enough of it, at least make sure you try to collect from an area and species mix, if you can tell, that is going to have more chance of success.
Yeah. I would say the thing that I've seen happen quite a bit too comes back down to the budgets again, getting them in the spring and then having the plant at some point over the summer. It's hard to be able to pick them or cut them in the winter and root them.
Yeah, you have that time constraint again. So if you're looking at using cutting in the short run, look at balsam poplar. Balsam poplar can be grown in the field with a much smaller size cutting with good success, good being relative for a cutting. So, provided the site is not overly competitive in the first year, we've had about 50%, long-term growth success from using 30 centimeter poplar cuttings. So like the leading shoots on, a bunch of poplar you'd collect on like a power line right away. Those things are always being shaved back. And so then they regrow and they're really nice material. So these are not large diameter plants, but they're nice terminal shoots. You don't have to monkey around too much with painting tops and things like this. You just cut the tops, soak them, and then outplant them. They're very easy to plant. And again, you lose half, but the other half provided good job of site prep, not excessive initial competition. You have a tree species in the mix, at least from the front end, and smaller material, which is beneficial, because that's what I don't like about cutting collections is just that labor cost with the winter collecting. Yeah.
Just make sure nobody plants aspen.
Yeah, don't collect aspen cuttings. They're not going to grow. So yeah, you make sure, whoever's collecting knows, they know what species they're looking at. I mean, they are pretty well apart, but anyone that's new to it might not see it in quite the same way. So conscientious, but your ID skills are good.
Because I've had people that thought that you could stake aspen.
Oh, no.
To them that you cannot stake aspen, they won't survive. So just a good clarification for everyone that's listening. Balsam poplar and willow only. Yes,
balsam poplar, willow only. Western dogwood also does root from cuttings, but I've never field planted as a cutting. But I have heard people doing it in BC where it's wetter. Again, dogwood, root it. Probably better to root it anyway, because it's hard to collect the size of material you need in the field because dogwood is browsed so heavily anyway. But it's another one that would potentially be able to root from a cutting.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Amanda. I had some really good takeaways. I got like 4 pages of notes here, but some of the key ones that I highlighted were mixing some deciduous and shrubs in with your conifer species so that it doesn't end up like the picture behind you.
Yeah.
And rough and loose site prep. Basically just site prep in rough and loose characteristic is a lot of benefits. I wrote down a bunch of the ones that you had for benefits here. And yeah, just be cautious when you're using herbicide. Think about what your goals are before you go out there and do it, so you don't end up killing a bunch of species that should still be there. And yeah, those are some of the main ones that I highlighted, but like I said, I have a few pages here. Actually, one question I had was the depth of planting stakings. What would you recommend for depth deep?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of function of the size of the cutting you have as well. But probably, I mean, with a larger cutting, less than 30 centimeters and deeper is better. The more you can get cutting into the ground and into moisture, the better. Of course, with a 30 centimeter cutting, you're probably only going to plant it 25 centimeters in the ground, right? Because you're going to leave a little bit on the top. So it's a bit of a function of the size of the cutting. So, it could be a third of the cutting in the ground or some permutation thereof, depending on the material size and also depending on the site conditions. If it's a really, really stinky, wet site, you probably don't have to plant them all that deep. But if you're using that cutting for bioengineering, you need to plant it deeper because you're providing structural support with that cutting. So like everything, depending on the conditions.
Yeah, for sure. So Amanda, where can people go to get more information on the subjects that you specialize in? Is there some sort of place that they can go to read some of your findings over the years? And is there any sort of, you mentioned the research extension education. I know that I've attended a bunch of the, I think they were through like Facebook or something. And I've done some in-person ones before COVID. Just wondering what sort of resources are out there for forestry professionals or people working in the reclamation remediation industry, as to where they can go to find information to make sure that they're able to do the best that they can to achieve success on their sites, other than just maybe more scientific information that they can utilize.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, our Center for Boreal Research has a website with all of our technical notes. We have videos, old presentations, publications, anything that, that we can put out in the public domain, we make effort to do. So I can send you the link after this podcast. And more generally, outside of what we have within our own research organization, there was a national portal that was launched, I don't know, a year or two ago now, the Pplm Portal. I can send you the link to that as well. And that is a portal that has an amalgamation of information from a variety of organizations and research organizations and nonprofits that have been putting out extension material on a host of topics, lots around land reclamation, of course, and wetland restoration, and things related to forest harvesting best practices. And it's like I said, a national website that we, Nate, are linked into as well. And that would be a really great place for folks to go to find all kinds of resources. And it's all at least in one website, right? So it's all interlinked there. It was a really nice initiative that was developed a couple years ago by a group of organizations, including me. That's where I'd start anyway.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Riley, if you can add the links into the YouTube video comments or into the recording, that'd be great, so people can know where to go. And other than that, we really appreciate your time, Amanda. You have a wealth of information that you shared today, and it's super appreciated. I hope that our viewers get a lot of information, and hopefully that helps answer some questions that people might in the industry might have. And yeah, thanks again for attending Industry Talks with Forteck.
No problem. Thanks again for having me, and yeah, have a happy afternoon.